first to thank the individual and institutional organizers of this workshop for accommodating me somewhat belatedly to the event, which I have greatly enjoyed and have learned a lot from it already. My original plan, which I discussed with Boaz, was to focus more on the so-called thinking in opposites in early theosophy and the interaction of early theosophy with Zoroastrianism in North India, and how did it impact on the reformist tendencies among Parsi and lay and some clerical intellectuals and theologians. But then I thought that it may be more fitting for the purposes of this conference or this workshop to focus on some East European and Eurasian appropriations of theosophy, where I can present, I think, some newly unearthed material and hopefully some fresh and challenging perspectives. Probably this was a better solution, I think, since I'll be able to connect, I think, directly to some of the problematic already discussed in the first 2 days of the conference. First, some introductory remarks. We have already been discussing in some detail various patterns of the domestication of theosophy in certain European and North American contexts. Just to add, as already sort of shown in the previous lecture, in the homeland of Blavatsky herself, theosophy variously interacted with traditional currents of non-normative religiosity, as well as fashionable intellectual and artistic currents, like the God-seeking movement, for example. Thus, the syncretistic potential of early theosophy, which we have been discussing, was further developed and widened in late imperial Russia, which of course directly bordered with the Asian East, interacted with it, and of course expanded furiously into it. And in the Amsterdam Conference on Visual Arts and Theosophy, there were several contributions on the way that sort of non-normative popular folk religiosity, layers of this can be sort of detected in the work of Kandinsky, Malevich, as well as other Russian artists. Do we encounter similar dynamics of theosophical appropriations in East European areas, which were under the control of the Ottoman Empire, variously until the late 18th or late 19th century? In all these areas, of course, accelerated exposure to European modernity came to include also the impact of the 19th century occult revival in Europe, and eventually theosophy. So did traditional and inherited, actual or perceived forms of religious and mystical thought interact with the philosophic currents of Western and Central European esoteric modernity? That will be the questions that I will try to discuss. Again, a bit more introductory remarks. I will go back a few centuries further than Victoria did yesterday in discussing the background, as I think that we need sort of a more, how to put it, slightly more detailed religious and cultural background to the late 19th, early 20th century developments, which I'm going to discuss. To generalize, publications in the last 20 years or so have reassessed the history and trajectories of the survival of Hermetic and Greco-Egyptian magical literature in Byzantium and Eastern Christendom. These publications also have opened new vistas for the study of what we now describe as several waves of Hermetic revival in Byzantium, also in relation to the interaction and interchange with the Muslim, Arab, and Persian Hermetic and esoteric currents and undercurrents at various periods of history. These new studies have been often ignored in overviews of the growing, evolving field of Western esotericism, but lately, due to the efforts of scholars like Walter Hanegraaff and others, this was brought to the attention to students of Western esotericism, And this concerns particularly the field, which is sort of a new field, the emergence of influential currents of transconfessional esotericism, and also the notion of supraconfessional illuminated brotherhood, or elite, thus post-Christian, post-Muslim, post-Judaic, in late Byzantine and early Ottoman period. To this complex picture, we must add the new approaches to Kabbalistic literature in late Byzantine and Byzantine Commonwealth periods, which have been brought to the attention again of the wider public by a recent survey article by Moshe Idel, where it has been demonstrated, again, decades of research were brought to those who cannot read the sort of evolving Hebrew studies on Kabbalistic literature. This period is paleography, codicology, etc. So it has been demonstrated in this article that various crucial Kabbalistic texts from the 14th, early 15th century, previously thought of as being created in Western Jewish milieux, needs to be relocated to Byzantine areas of the late 14th and 15th centuries. So if I can make at this stage, if I'm allowed to make an academic prediction for the development of the field in the next 10 years, I would predict that the study of the court of Lorenzo de' Medici and its role in Western esotericism soon will be preceded by the study of the developments in the court of Musa Çelebi, one of the Ottoman pretenders to the Sultanate in the early 15th century, which we know now that in Edirne, that what I mentioned, these developments I mentioned, were sort of flourishing in the early 15th century, and the hermetic martyrdom of Giordano Bruno will need to be preceded by the martyrdom of one of the main transconfessional esotericists of the early 15th century, Sheikh Bedreddin. As you can see, he was hanged, and sort of that is his major heretical or mega heretical tract, which has been condemned, destroyed, sort of variously during the Ottoman period by the succession of the Sunni ulemas. So I believe we're at this stage. So also apart from and for everyone who thinks that this can be a challenge to the Eurocentric perspective of some approaches to Western esotericism, let me add that it shouldn't be a problem, because Musa Çelebi was a co-sultan of the European portion of the Ottoman Empire. So we're not challenging the Eurocentric perspective massively. So fast forward to the late 18th and early 19th century. I'm just referring to this picture in view of possible continuities of trends, even texts, during this period, which we haven't studied yet in detail. So picture is complex, of course. Since the late 18th century, we have the revival of Hesychasm or Neo-Hesychasm in Greek, Slavonic, Romanian-speaking areas under Ottoman control. Then we have the dense network of the dervish orders, among whom, particularly the Bektashes, were known for their sort of esoteric leanings, eclectic, suppressed in 1825, going underground and moving then towards various forms of Freemasonry, which became active in the late Ottoman Empire. At the same time, we also have clerical and lay elites sort of flirting, taking part in various sort of forms of craft and higher degrees Freemasonry. As I said, all this is a very accelerated development throughout the 19th century. I leave aside also the whole question of what has been happening to various forms of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in the Ottoman period, which all need to be reassessed in view of the survey article of Moshe Idel that I mentioned, as well as what has been happening in the sphere of Sabbatean or Gyomme sort of groups following the Sabbatean Messianic crisis in the second half of the 19th century. Generally also in the region, in the so-called imaginaire of the region, both clerical and non-clerical, we have also the presence, the memory of the medieval dualist heresies of Bogomilism and Paulicianism, which was seen, particularly in polemical literature, as a major underground dualist church opposed both to the Eastern Orthodox and the Catholic Church. So how did these religious spiritual traditions, both actual and in the imaginaire of the area, interacted with sort of the 19th century developments in Europe and North America? Also, we need at this stage to address the question, did any of these traditions play a role in the construction of esoteric traditions in Western Europe and North America in the 19th century? First, of course, one needs to say that, of course, already dualist heresies have entered the grand conspiratorial narratives of the chain command or whatever, chain history, genealogy of the subversive anti-clerical heretical movements which were created in the wake of the French Revolution in the late 19th century. But I will also here address something which is not so well known, and that is the attitude of Albert Pike, one of the chief theoreticians of the Scottish rites, the Southern jurisdiction. That's him, and that's his tomb in the House of the Temple in Washington, D.C. And what we discover in his Morals and Dogma of the Scottish Rite, I'm not going to read all of it. I think it's well readable. I think it's sort of essential to some of the topics of our conference. As you can see here, we have, how to put it, a threefold connection established between what he sees as Christianity of St. John, the mysterious doctrines of the Kabbalah, and the dissident sects of the Gnostic anti-Illuminati. The following paragraph follows, introduces, of course, the fashionable Templarist narrative, but notice here the role of the Patriarchs of Constantinople in this particular chain, underground chain of tradition, and something, of course, which is at the core of the various Masonic narratives. And as we know, as a military man, Albert Pike didn't swallow his punchline, so he finally sort of moves to the last paragraph of this of his claim towards the end of the Morals and Dogma of the Scottish Rite. Sort of these would prevail over these, and the Patriarchs of Constantinople would possess themselves of the papal power. So, very much the Patriarchate of Constantinople and the Oriental Patriarchates, part of a narrative of a succession of underground movements, which, as I said, combined in a threefold way the doctrines of the Kabbalah, Gnostic, illuminated elites, all related also to the main sort of the main topoi of the Masonic narratives of this particular period. This incidentally may explain why we have various pictures from this period of various patriarchs of Constantinople and Jerusalem in Masonic regalia. So Pike clearly had very high expectations of them. But this is one of the subjects that's particularly difficult to research due to the difficulty of access to the relevant sort of patriarchates archival libraries, although we have some evidence. So what happened on the ground after all this sort of legacy of attitudes, internal, external, etc.? First, I will focus a bit more on Bulgaria, sort of to round up the picture that we began to assemble yesterday about Southeast Europe and the Mediterranean. And we'll begin with the introduction of Theosophy and Theosophical sort of periodicals in post-Ottoman Bulgaria, which started, as in many other places, from the 1890s onwards. Also, as you will see, Bulgaria was also very important in these narratives that I already began to dissect, due to the strength of the Bogomil-Albigensian imaginaire in the area, much stronger than other areas, with the exceptions of Bosnia-Herzegovina, then under Austro-Hungarian within the borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So we have the sort of proliferation of theosophical periodicals, one after another. One of them was eventually named Orpheus, and that would connect to some of the themes already covered by Victoria yesterday, the way local indigenous traditions were brought, or perceived as indigenous, were brought to the identitarian theosophical narratives in the late 19th, early 20th century. Under the influence of theosophy, or under the partial influence of theosophy, we have also the emergence, I would imagine, of the first proper new religious movements in the post-Ottoman world. And that's the movement of the so-called Universal White Brotherhood, which still goes in strength, international strength, of Peter Dernov, who was introduced to theosophical doctrines, to theosophy, later to anthroposophical also speculation, during his period in the States in the late 19th century. So I'm speaking just about his sort of early theosophical exposure. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on him because it's a known movement with his prophetic figure and iconography. I'm just going to say that the theosophic influence in his system is particularly evident in the so-called cosmic, in the notion of cosmic racial cycles, which, as we know, some scholars describe as cosmic Darwinism. Not necessarily agree, I'm just quoting this. And in this particular cycles, he introduces a good measure of Slavophile sort of theory, in which, of course, sort of the culmination of the development of the cosmic cycles, various root and so on races, leads directly towards the Slavonic age of Aquarius. What is also important, again in view of what Victoria said yesterday, is the immersion, the evolutionary triad of Orphism, Bogomilism, Universal White Brotherhood, connecting to these cycles. Thus, Orphism was, as indicated yesterday, in this context, again, utilized as a local, indigenous, regional religious trend, which was integrated into the theosophical narrative. Just for general sort of consumption, that's his, how to put it, corrective to the Steinerian Eurythmian dances, which are called the Pan-Eurythmian dances, which take place in a mountain in the southwest of Bulgaria, the so-called Seven Lakes of the Rila mountain, connected to the seven chakras, depending on the perspective of the Balkans, Europe, or the world, right? And they still go in strength, all these movements. Situation becomes more complex when actual academics, as always, enter the field of creation, coordination, the theosophical movement in Bulgaria. And here I'm thankful to Massimo for introducing the figure of Nikolai Rainov earlier in his talk, who was the main figure in the Bulgarian theosophical movement. He was first began to study in the Orthodox Theological Seminary, where theosophical clubs emerged, became heavily associated with the spread of and publication of translations of classical theosophical texts, including partially the Secret Doctrine of Blavatsky. What is important in his particular case, and there are still many sides to him that needs to be explored, is that he was an active academic, professor of the history of art in the Sofia Academy of Fine Arts, as well as prominent author, fiction writer. Eventually, he became a president of the Theosophical Society in Bulgaria, active publicist for theosophy, actively involved in lecturing about theosophy. Thus, he was one of the committed academic theosophists of the area. That's a later portrait of him. And as a theosophist, he also, as I tried to argue in my lecture in Amsterdam, created also interesting samples of philosophic art. I will return to this particular picture later on. But in 1919, after writing a book called Between Life and the Desert, in which he bravely, which is a kind of a gospel reassessment of the gospel narrative, in which he very boldly integrated elements of the Talmudic Toldot Yeshu story, he was excommunicated from the church. So unlike the Greek case, we have sort of bold heresiarchs already associated with Theosophy, becoming active on the Bulgarian scene. So was Peter Dönhoff in the early 1920s. So we have Theosophy or philosophically influenced new heresiarchs actually becoming involved in the conflict with the established clerical establishment and church. As a author, he was also able to develop, and surrounded by academic theosophists, he was able to indulge in a much more complex construction of tradition than, let's say, Peter Dönhoff or sort of proper leaders, charismatic leaders of new religious movements. He was, to summarize this, he managed to create a series of texts which, under the guise of apocryphal texts with strong Kabbalistic elements, with lots of Hekalot material that I'm not sure where he did get it from to begin with, was able to develop how to put it, two-layer theosophy. So elitist theosophy for these sort of academic or semi-academic theosophists, which created, as I said, a complicated tradition of inherited libraries of ancient Gnostic or medieval Kaffa Bogomil writings, and this is one of the places where that library was supposed to be housed. To samples of philosophic art, which I believe, and I was told so until recently unpublished, was also supposed to be accompanying sort of the meetings of this philosophic elite that I was describing from 1912 onwards. So very a quick run through some samples of this philosophic art, and that's... Yes, it was Maitreya before. Yes. That's before the Krishnamurti crisis that was already discussed. So some of them were meant also to illustrate the translation of Krishnamurti's book, as you can see. Sort of very quickly, because we don't have time, but I can return at any stage. And in this particular philosophical periodical from 1912 happened something which we discussed with Boaz during lunchtime, very sophisticated Kabbalistic polemics between one Countess Maria Karaja or Karadia and unnamed Kabbalists, where very complicated sort of geometric equilibristics discussions of a very high level have been exchanged. I haven't been able to locate or to learn who is behind one of the pseudonyms, but courtesy of Boaz, I know more about Countess Maria Karadia and her role in this particular sort of synthesis of Kabbalistic and philosophical ideas at this stage. So here I finish with Nikolai Rayanov and move briefly to Dmitry Mitrinovich, and here is his sort of Bosnian, Serbian, sort of avant-garde thinker. I will use actually a quotation from the book of Marco Pazzi, which has been circulated already on Alistair Crowley because it describes him very well. He moved to the UK after the beginning of the First World War, and Marco very correctly describes him as an eclectic visionary who combined concepts from theosophy, anthroposophy, Adlerian psychoanalysis, along with various speculations about the role of the Slavic and Aryan sort of race in the cosmic cycles. He was also a political utopianist, becoming involved in groups like New Europe, New Britain. Again, we have the influence of Theosophic cosmic cycles to some extent. Why, I think, apart from this influence on political utopianism and to slight neo-Gnostic elements in 2 or 3 of his writings, which I detected, he's particularly interesting, I think, for our purposes in the context of what was discussed in the paper on the tradition of no tradition. In a text from the late 30s, I believe, called The Free Revelations, he announces the post-guru sort of era in which the third revelation of a self-knowledge of every man will supersede the need of spiritual, charismatic guru leaders, etc., particularly sort of preserving his venom for Gurdjieff and Uspensky, to whom he sort of felt particularly, I wouldn't say animosity, but was obviously antagonistic to their way of sort of charismatic, whatever it's called. So an early devotee of Mitrinovich was Alan Watts, and through Alan Watts, some of the Mitrinovich ideas eventually did flow also into something which is discussed, the American counterculture of the 60s. So that, I think, was just a sideline into someone who played a role as a diaspora person in the UK Bloomsbury esoteric cultures and subcultures, with some element of Theosophy and Neo-Gnosticism on him. So, briefly, I will introduce also, not in detail, the Re-Oric, or the Re-Orics phenomena, as it is relevant to my topic. As we know, and Re-Oric is a well-known person, I don't need to get in big detail on him, about him, but so that's his wife. For me, what is relevant here, and I'm approaching the situation as a philologist, is the continuation of the Mahatma letters genre within the Re-Oric family. And I'm referring to it as a literary phenomenon, rather than sort of religious, spiritual, or esoteric. And that, of course, became, these are some of his well-known Himalayan landscapes. As we know, he was involved in several cycles of Central Asian, Himalayan expeditions, all devoted to sort of Shambhala, messianic speculations, again heavily influenced by Theosophy, but courtesy of the sort of resurgent flow of Mahatma letters, was colored with new types of messianism, very much related to various trends of the Russian Silver Age, already discussed. Here is another interesting quote I got from Marco Pazzi's book, and that's a letter from Alistair Crowley to, I think, the Moscow correspondent of New York Times, that I'm not going to read, but it, I think, Crowley connected here better than some other contemporary Kremlinologists on some elements of contemporary early Soviet Russian culture that until recently had not been sort of properly discussed and explored. So in this case, just 3 sentences. We now know, courtesy of several publications, the existence of Theosophic Lodge or circle within the proto-KGB Cheka GPU of the 1920s, and much more details about the Red Shambhala project, which was obviously a corrective to the White Shambhala project of, the various white Russian sort of Central Asian and also immigrant population sort of notions. And as part of this Red Shambhala project, we have people like Brachov and a few other sort of highly positioned, as I said, operatives who were entirely infused to Theosophical ideas, or versions of Theosophical ideas. At that stage, sort of assessing some of Blavatskyan cosmic development cosmic Darwinism trajectories within Marxist or semi-Marxist, semi-Leninist context. And this leads us to the most controversial period of Nikolai Re-Orient's life, the so-called Mahatma Lenin letters, which were given to Chicherin in 1926. I'm not going to present the arguments pro and contra, how did this happen, why did this happen, but this was an important element, important episode in which all these thinkers and operatives of the time of Lunacharsky, Chicherin, and the others were able to instrumentalize, at least to some extent, the Re-Oric version of Theosophy and their Central Asian expeditions for this sort of Red Shambhala project. There are 3 or 4 publications on this, and I can gladly give the references to anyone interested. Since wisely Nicholas Re-Oric never returned to Russia despite numerous invitations and moved to the States, as we know in the 1930s we have the various Re-Oric initiatives, the Assembly of Peace, the Re-Oric's Pact for the protection of cultural heritage in times of conflict, and their eventual work in the Kulu Valley in India, where they are here pictured, the establishment of the Institute for Himalayan Studies. Here their meetings with Nehru and Indira Gandhi, that's from the 30s. And the institutions, of course, stayed in a variety of shapes and forms until continue to exist and to exercise influence in this period. Here I'm going to raise one research question, I think useful for our discussion, the concluding sessions. Why in these East European contexts, artistic elites of the time of Re-Oric, Reinhoff, etc., something which Massimo also raised, played such an important role in Theosophy? Was it because, let's say, Kandinsky and his circle, in which also Mitrinovich moved, were considering, or shall we say, were proposing the notion of artistic intellectual brotherhood, elite, entrusted with the mission of transforming, changing the world through their sort of interaction with spiritualist currents like Theosophy? I think that's useful to discuss, also in the context of the fact that Re-Oric established particularly close relations with Bulgaria in the 1920s and the 30s, exactly due to the existence of such theosophically inspired artistic elites. And this is one of the people, that's Boris Georgiev, who actually studied under Re-Oric and traveled to the Himalayas in the Indias of the 1920s and 30s to meet with Re-Oric and other people from his circle. That's his portrait of the White Brotherhood founder, Peter Dönhoff. That's a bit of Orientalism for you in his pictures, encounters in India. And that's one of the manifestos of, shall we say, perennialism, the perennial quest. A painting from his Italian period, when he settled in Italy. And from here, I move to a question that Boaz raised, and this was the question of interaction of Jewish Kabbalists, potentially Jewish Theosophists, already in the culture of the 1930s. And again, the example here is one of Sophia's chief rabbis in the difficult period of the 30s and the Second World War, who was known to have become close to that's Daniel Zion, was known to have become very close to the Peter Dönhoff, the founder of the Universal White Brotherhood. That's his tomb. And as one of the chief rabbis of Bulgaria, he produced, during the period of the Second World War, a text on Kabbalah, this is a new edition, but the early edition should look like one of his earlier texts. That's the threefold way of the threefold path of the new man. What is interesting in this particular case is that Daniel Zion, at that stage, was obviously developing some sort of syncretism, Judeo-Christian syncretism, infused with some white brotherhood and philosophic ideas. It wasn't yet clear because these were difficult times. He had to take refuge in the metropolitan residence of the exarch of the Bulgarian church, who had also strong esoteric interests. And then when he moved to Jaffa in Israel, and also was obviously one of the rabbis of the Bulgarian Jewish community who massively moved to Israel in this period, he produced a sequence of mystical, slightly messianic poems, which came close to what I think you name Messianic Judaism. And as such, created one of the big controversies of 1949, 1950, very active, vigorous discussions in early Israeli rabbinic milieux, but he continued on writing these poems, mystical speculations, until his death in the 1970s. So that's a figure that should be included in the list of Boaz, probably not directly influenced by Theosophy, but via all these channels. And to finish, the last 5 minutes, I think I'm approaching, I'm going briefly to discuss one of the very interesting phenomena of Theosophy, in a way fighting back in the height of the Cold War period, sort of mid to late 70s, when the daughter of the Bulgarian party, Communist Party, a sort of chieftain and dictator Zhivkov, was converted to the Agni Yoga living ethics version of Theosophy of the Re-Orics by the son of the person that I have been already discussing, Nikolai Rainov, Bogomil Rainov, who inherited his chair as a professor of history of art in the Sofia Academy of Fine Arts. So what happened briefly during this period was that Zhivkova, who is here seen with giving various Bulgarian top medals, etc., to Svetoslav Re-Orich, the son of Nikolai Re-Orich, created a mini esoteric cult of her own, which was more or less from 1975, 1976 onwards, which was very much concerned with putting into practice, definitely, various precepts of the Agni Yoga living ethics, Re-Orich's version of Theosophical tradition. And as being in her socio-political position, she was able to top down, to sort of realize variety of projects which may well be considered eccentric, but not from Theosophic point of view. She's here with Indira Gandhi, who was also recruited for the cause, as well as the president of Mexico at that stage, Jose Lopez Portillo, so she was working on this particular high levels. She resurrected various initiatives and programs of the Re-Orich family, like the Assembly of Peace, the Flag of Peace, and various others, as well as this is one of these assemblies of peace where various luminaries, including Svetoslav Re-Orich, can be seen, indulged in a considerably interesting esoteric geopolitics, which we cannot still reconstruct, but there are various elements to it that are quite interesting, some sort of utopianism, as well as started the programs of the so-called Renaissance men in Eastern Europe. The first was, of course, Nikolai Re-Orich, the second was Leonardo da Vinci, and then she visited Svetoslav Re-Orich in the Kulu Valley in India, and all of a sudden died, which has created a lot of conspiracy theories, particularly within the Re-Orich movement, which currently has been sort of reinforced after the end of communism. And that's one of her addresses to one of the Children's Assembly of Peace. I'm not sure they were able to follow this, as you can see, but you may very well see that all the echoes from Elena Re-Orich's sort of rephrasal of some of the main Blavatskys teaching. In the post-communist period, the Russian Church has taken a very strong stance against the revival of the Re-Orich movement in Russia, following private meeting between Svetoslav Rorik and Gorbachev in 1987. So what I was planning, and I hopefully sort of managed to sort of demonstrate that in such East European and Eurasian context, we have had developments in which, as you can see, various currents sort of crisscrossed from Blavatskyan Theosophy, various cases of Jewish Kabbalistic sort of speculation in theosophical, semi-theosophic context, to sort of, as I said, these curious developments at the sort of the height of the Cold War, which remain little known but indicative of what can happen again in this East European Eurasian context, which I believe I have shown deserve further attention. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you for a fascinating paper. We have about 5 minutes for questions, so Marco, and we'll 1, 2, 3.
One of the disasters of the occupation period and the war, Second World War, was the fact that many of the archives of esoteric, occultist, Masonic organizations in countries that were occupied by the Germans were confiscated and taken to Germany. And then, when the Russians invaded Germany, they were brought to Russia. So this is still a story that perhaps has to be told and researched in detail. There are perhaps many interesting aspects there. For instance, why were these documents being confiscated? What was the purpose? What was the idea behind it? But also, the interesting question is, what happened to these documents when they landed in Russia? Were they just left to sleep there and nobody was interested? Because the fact that there were perhaps persons or even groups in the KGB who were interested in theosophy and esotericism opens up the question. Were they also having a look at the documents there and taking inspiration from what they could find there? Or these documents had been just been left there to take dust until the fall of the Soviet regime?
In the case of these groups, the Theosophic lodges, so-called, within the KGB, the proto-KGB organizations, most of these people were anyway killed during the 1930s, before the war.
Yeah.
So these guys were eliminated anyway. But I have to say that now in the post-communist period, most of the documents of these trials against these people, and we have a variety of groups in early Soviet Russia, as the Silver Age was still continuing in the 1920s, we have a lot of groups, from the so-called New Templar groups to sort of New Rosicrucian, etc. The interesting thing about Russia, early Soviet Russia, is a lot of these theosophically inspired groups were not artistic elites, but scholarly, scientific elites. And when these groups were persecuted, put to trial, partially eliminated, the documents were kept and they now have been published. What happened, I don't think access to the documents after the Second World War was easy, in any case. But what happened with the most secretive parts of the Secret Service, the KGB, who were dealing with this parapsychology and the occult, this belongs to the discipline, the anthropology of secret services, which is, we haven't started yet. But I'm sure they had access, some access. But as you know, some of these documents have been returned now to Poznan in Poland, so they're open for research. But generally, libraries haven't really disappeared in Russia. They have been secreted, access has been made difficult, but various recent libraries, like the Arseniev library...
That's the point, they didn't destroy them.
No, they didn't.
They kept them very precious.
That's my evidence for that.
Our 5 minutes for questions and answers has just basically come to an end. At the risk of taking a few minutes off of our coffee break, let's take those 2 questions and hope that we can keep the questions and the response to...
Okay, I'll be super brief. You start with the Cold War. I'm curious about the present day, where there are virulent nationalist movements in places like Russia and Serbia. Do any of those sort of tap into this Blavatskyan root race kind of thinking?
Yes, they have.
Yeah.
They have. What I pointed to, the Slavophile thing of the 20s, had been variously utilized in various sort of sections, but fringe enough of ethno-confessional nationalism. In Russia, particularly, people like Alexander Dugin has been using theosophical ideas for esoteric geopolitics. Serbia, not so much, but they have been tapping into this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's similar, and also about the discussion that we had after Holler's paper. In the conferences about new religious movements now, there is almost in all conferences a session about Missa in Romania and the police interventions about this quite large group, including in Italy and in other countries, not only in Romania. So it seems to me that it's quite contemporary. We do have post-theosophical, well, that's a yogi group, sex magic, yogi, theosophy, all lumped together, which try to organize under an authoritarian leader. We have normally the Orthodox Church blowing the whistle and calling for police intervention, and we do have police intervention. So it's still going on. And only Missa is a large group, 40,000 people in Europe, with very aggressive lawyers taking the cases to the European level. So the leader is out of reach of the Romanian justice because he's been granted political asylum in Sweden as persecuted by the Orthodox Church in Romania. And the legal dynamic is quite complicated, but it's still going on. There is still, when these groups organize, become visible, and particularly has something to do with sexuality, immediately there is a reaction.
Yeah. The sentence that I would like to add is that the Eastern Orthodox churches have made various very clear statements during various councils of the Orthodox bishops on the new religious movements, the White Brotherhood or the Re-Oric Pact. I think there was a special meeting of the Council of Russian bishops on the revival of the Re-Oric movement, when it was again sort of condemned as a heresy, etc., etc. So they take, as you say, more or less immediate reaction, as well as low-level and high-level Eastern Orthodox polemics against the new religious movements has been published. So at low level it's obvious, high level is a bit more interesting. So this is dynamic sphere of post-communist transformations and change.
Thank you, Professor Stoyanov.